You guys sent some pretty interesting questions. Man, there's a lot of good ones here. And some of these are bombs, which bring up other topics as well. It's difficult to know where to start. We're going to start with this, though. And even though George mentioned that he wasn't going to be in the panel, we pulled him back in. You're not getting off that easy. So I'm going to start with a question for you. Regarding the statement that truth matters, why is truth so important? Are there not situations in which telling or believing lies might be beneficial to either an individual or society? Can the telling or believing in lies, in fact, lead to truth?
Does the person want me to tell them the true answer or to lie?
Perhaps if you lie to them, it'll lead them to the truth.
The question is valid, though, isn't it? And one of the things that you need to take away from this evening is the fact that good things are not laid out like a smorgasbord. You can't take a bit when you want it and leave the rest. And they're organized differently. Lewis, a long while ago, said most heresy is a good thing in a wrong place. The devil is subtle. So in this particular instance, for instance, if you're hiding a Jew in the cellar and a Gestapo man comes to the door and says, "Are there any Jews in your cellar?" It's not wrong to lie, is it? Because he has no right to that information, and he is breaking the order of the goods. So, yes, I mean, you don't tell your wife everything you think, do you?
There might be some marriage counseling available for you later.
Oh boy. All right, here's another one, and this is open to any one of you. Regarding the limitations of science, is it possible for the scientific process to be used to determine the purpose or intent behind something? Can science lead us not only to the how, but also to the why? Go for it.
Oh. No, I took it off, yeah. Certainly science can tell us the purpose of some things. And the purpose of an eye is pretty obvious. Purpose of stomachs and so on. So you, as Richard Dawkins wrote, any engineer can can likely tell the purpose of a system by looking at how the parts interact. So you can tell what the, I guess, mechanical purpose is, but I don't know. I certainly wouldn't say that science can say anything like what the moral purpose of a system is.
Again, there's a question underneath that question that you need to think about. And that is the nature of the Christian story as a whole. And the Christian story is a love story. Can you force someone to love you? No. It therefore follows that God, for the purpose that he is about now, of turning us into lovers, cannot overwhelm our free will, because then he'd get another angel and he's got plenty. George will probably disagree with me.
No, all I would just say is it's not an either or. The problem is when science, it's a well-known problem that science can't prove the scientific method. That you figure that out by reason, and so it's the question implies a type of scientism, which in fact the scientific method doesn't prove that science works, that it's true. So the problem isn't whether science works. Of course we believe that science works. It just can't be the only arbiter to truth.
Can I say one more thing? And that is, it's critical to realize that science uses philosophy and imagination and thought all the time. There's no such thing as data or hypotheses or laws or anything. None of that is the result of some experiment, but many scientists simply don't see that. It seems invisible to them. So coming up with the purpose even of an eye, is something beyond science, but it's something we can easily do because we have minds.
A lot of the questions I came up with
Can I just
regard-
make one comment on
Yes,
this?
of course.
One other thing you might start making a list of for your children's benefit is the number of people who believed who made major steps forward. And they will tell you again and again and again that it wasn't immediately obvious. What they saw was what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge. And I think the best example of this that many of you may have had is conversion. I would put it to you that although you have a conversion story, it's your conversion story. It's not anyone else's. And you can't lift it off one person and fit it on another. And I can't explain how I became a Christian, but I cannot deny that I did. Now, similar things happen in science. Tacit knowledge is a very, very powerful concept, and it explains many things. Einstein famously was talking to a friend, and suddenly the friend said something which coalesced into the next step in what he'd been thinking about all morning in the patent office, where obviously he wasn't filling in patents. But he said, stop, and he went away, and that was the beginning of relativity. And there are many examples of that. Several people looking at the same data, and one will see it, and they will say, I didn't see it, I was shown it. The most recent lovely example that I know of is from your neck of the woods, Seattle. 20 years ago or so, when we got to the stage where we had biochemical scissors, and we thought we knew where genes started and where they finished, so we could snip them out and put them into a bacteria and get the protein. But every now and again, we got two proteins, but we thought we'd only got one. And nobody knew how it worked. But the guy who worked it out in Seattle was a Christian, and he was sitting in his lab after midnight looking at this sequence of somewhere between 750 and 1,000 letters in the right order, and every triplet is an amino acid. Link them all together, you've got a protein. It's easier to think of it digitally, 1, 2, 3, 4, that way, because then you see what's happening more clearly. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you go off like that for 1,000 or so, you've got a protein. But then he suddenly saw in his lab that, you can go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. God doesn't waste paper, he overwrites. We can't do that, but literally in our DNA, God is using the same letters twice, out by one, and getting entirely different functional proteins. It's beyond belief. And the guy said when he saw this, and he insists he didn't work it out, he sat there enjoying the fact for the next 2 hours that only he and God knew this.
On this topic, a lot of the questions have been relating to science and its interaction with other disciplines like philosophy or theology, and not just the intersection between science and these disciplines, but perhaps even the overlap. So following on from this, to you, Dr. Behe, William Lane Craig said, I think it is advisable to capitalize intelligent design, to differentiate theology from science. Why do you or don't you capitalize IDT, which I think stands for Intelligent Design Theory, in your writings? Is intelligent design theory theology or science?
Well, I think some of my remarks in my talk spoke to that. When you saw the jungle trap, would you use capital letters to characterize your conclusion, this is intelligently designed? No, because it's a commonplace. We do it all the time. When we see design in life, see it in proteins, in the genetic code discovered in the late 50s, early 60s. What kind of thing does a code require? Code requires a coder, a designer, and it's always associated with a mind. So intelligence is something we know intimately. We're intelligent, and we know the effects and what intelligence can do. So I don't capitalize the term because that would seem pretentious for such a mundane activity.
There are a couple questions regarding the potential of theistic evolution to bring the bridge the Grand Canyon between evolution and Christianity. So here's a question. Given that God created nature, why is the idea that natural processes explain the development of species in space-time necessarily incompatible with the other idea that God performs an eternal act of creation that sustains the world? Aren't they compatible? Can't there be physical correlates for spiritual things? It's open to any one of you.
And it's a question you get asked all the while. I don't think it's as difficult as you imagine. Anybody who doesn't recognize that microevolution happens even in lifetimes, of our kind of lifetimes. There were no fruit flies in Hawaii till we took them there. Now there are species of Hawaii, fruit fly, which don't interbreed with those that were left behind. That, by definition, is the emergence of a new species. That's not the only example. There are many. So at that level, yes, that we can get to a process that doesn't require God for that to actually happen. But you take the big picture as a whole, and don't even, if you're not a scientist, don't even start with science. It's not the smart place to start. The best example I know of why evolution cannot be an explanation of us is David Stove's lovely book, Darwinian Fairy Tales. David Stove was Australia's best analytical philosopher, an atheist who committed suicide when he found he got cancer, which is a rational thing to do if you believe that life has no ultimate meaning. But he really couldn't understand the Kant in modern philosophy, with a C, not a K. He simply said it's irrational. And you cannot get to individual altruism by a Darwinian route. It doesn't exist. So stick with the amazing phenomenon that we will jump in front of a bus to rescue any child. The only model of Darwinism that will account for that doesn't account for it, because it will only do group altruism. And for that to work, before you grab the child at the risk of your own life, you do a swift calculus of how many shared genes you have. And we simply don't behave that way. And that's the only way they can explain it. The guy who did it, Willie Hamilton, got accolades in his obituary in both Science and Nature when he died, but he hadn't actually explained the problem. So the thing to go for is morality. Where does it come from? Particularly individual altruism.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, George, before you speak, I think maybe where this is coming from is the sense where you have, because you talked about the chasm, right? And how you have natural processes that can explain how life came to be. And then this understanding of God sustaining creation is an idea you can maybe find, let's say, Colossians 1:17, where it says, in him all things hold together. So can you have this understanding of God as creator in the sense of sustaining creation? And is that not compatible with an evolutionary theory of how life came to be through these natural processes?
So let's just imagine for a moment that the book of Genesis, the chapter 1 is literal. Just imagine for a moment. You don't have to believe it or not. Just imagine it's literal. And so on the end of the sixth day, everything's created, and the seventh day God rests. And imagine that God shows up and he allows you and a group of scientific friends and lumberjacks to go back in time to the eighth day, the first day of the new week. If you go there, are there stars in the sky? Yes. Well, actually, it would take 6 years for the closest star, for the light to come. But we know that there'd be stars in the sky. If you cut down a tree, would the tree have rings? Yes. You know that the world is only 6 days long, but it might be a tree that's a couple hundred years old. Maybe there's an olive tree that's 800 years old. God could have made a world like our church meets in the Ottawa Little Theatre, and sometimes when some of my young grandchildren come, they'd like to get permission from me to go up and see the set. And if you come up and see the set, it looks like a room or something, but you just walk through it and it's just a facade. There's nothing behind it. God could have invented and created a world like that, but he didn't. He created a world with unbelievable depth. Now, maybe it will be that Jesus tarries for 300 years, and before he comes back, or just the day before he comes back, At the same time, the physicist will come to the end of the world and they'll say, here's the end of the stage designed by God. And it's the same day that some biologist has gone as deep as they possibly can and they come to the end of the stage and they see designed by God. And 10 minutes later, Jesus comes back. Maybe that's what'll happen. But the fact of the matter is that God made an unbelievably deep and rich world. And he made it so that we could be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. And we have dominion over the earth by studying the depths of these molecular processes to help with medicine and all sorts of, and who knows what other things we will learn from him. So the issue isn't whether you can study things. The issue is really John Patrick's example, this sentence assemble itself. That's the big divide that's at stake here, not whether or not you can use your mind and science to try to figure all these things out in a world that God has created and sustained. I don't know if that sort of gets at the question a little bit.
I'm going to interpret the question a little bit differently. I frequently get the question of, does God have to intervene in nature? Does he make, the Cambrian explosion in a literal puff of smoke, and we can debate those questions. The interesting thing about design is that you can tell something was designed without knowing how it was made or its history. If you rounded a corner and you looked up and saw Mount Rushmore and you had never heard of it before, you would immediately know it was designed. You would know when it was designed. Could have been, 1,000 years ago, thousands of years ago, last week. You can't tell just by looking immediately at it. You don't know who made it. You don't know how it was carved or anything like that, but you immediately know it was made. So the question of whether God intervened in the process of making life, and intervened is a loaded word because, as William Dembski, another ID proponent, has often said, we don't say that a violinist intervenes to make notes coming out of the violin. The violin is built to be played by the violinist. What if nature is built to be guided by God? We can say that God, guided it, or that everything necessary for the unfolding of life was put into the beginning, into the Big Bang or something. But in that case, God designed it, he programmed it into nature, he guided it along the way, he did something, not necessarily puff of smoke creation. But those are other questions. And we can, the most important thing, as I tried to make clear in the talk, is not, common descent or natural selection or how it got here. It's that we can tell just by looking at the system immediately when we see it. Immediately when you see a mousetrap, immediately when you see a flagellum, you can tell it was designed because you see the strong purpose and the purposeful arrangement of parts.
And kind of a follow-up to that, Dr. Behe. One person asks, in the years since you wrote Darwin's Black Box, has anyone proposed any explanation for how any of the irreducibly complex problems you talked about in the book could have happened through random mutation? If yes, what is the best explanation that you've heard?
No, they haven't. There have occasionally been papers or comments or things where somebody says, well, this, that, or the other thing. But they're always either questions about common descent, which doesn't answer the problem of how, or they're very, 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 very sketchy and speculative so that they don't even count. I have an appendix in my new book, Darwin Devolves, which looks back on several of the examples from Darwin's Black Box from a perspective of 20 years later. And the number of papers that have proposed how a flagellum might evolve by a Darwinian mechanism is 0. The same as it was when I wrote the book. The number of papers that explain how Darwinian mechanism might produce something like the blood clotting cascade is 0. So maybe the fruitlessness of Darwin's theory at the foundational level of life is telling us something about the nature of how life got here.
So if there is so much evidence that Darwinism is improbable, why is this not made more popular in our society? Is the scientific community preventing this? I'll leave this open to all of you.
The questions that keep everybody awake at night at some stage are not scientific questions. So the more we have scientific explanations, it doesn't answer the question that every doctor has to deal with every time you tell someone nasty information. Why is this happening to me now? There are no scientific explanations for that. You need explanations. And the amazing thing is that the Christian story can give those explanations. We need to bear witness to the way things have happened in our own lives, much more than we do. We are frightened to speak. But even in the modern world, you are always at liberty to tell your own story in one way or another, as long as it's your story. The opposition make their stories up. They start from the conclusion and work backwards. We work the other way around. My favorite example of this, and you can start thinking, you've all got some sort of story like this in your life, and you need to talk about it. But the one I always start with is from a colleague who was the professor of pediatric oncology at Yale, a woman called Diane Comp. Now, she, like me, grew up in a Christian home, went off to university, and faith got sidelined very quickly in practice. The schizophrenic thing that George alluded to happens. I became a reductionist without knowing the word. That's the basic problem that happens when we go to university. It happened to Diane too. Now, she's very smart, and she intimidated the men, so she knew that she was very unlikely to get married. But while she was at university, she turned into an existentialist. She came to believe that life had no ultimate meaning. And so, what do you do when you've got to that stage? You do what gives you pleasure. That's all that's left to you, to be as happy as you can for as long as you can be. And she loved children, and she loved caring for them. So she did pediatrics. Then, rather foolishly, she did oncology. Now, in oncology, children die. If you believe that the world has no meaning, it's just absurd at the end of the day, what do you say to a dying child and to the parents? You have nothing to say. The only honest thing would be, this is absurd, I'm glad it's you dying and not me. That's neither kind nor helpful, and for no good reason. She was both kind and helpful. But her mother kept turning up at the back of her head and saying, I didn't bring you up to behave like this. You love those children, they love you, you ought to be there when they die. And of course you give in to your conscience eventually. I had the same experience much later, but the first little girl she sat with was a little girl of about 8, dying of leukemia, fading away in a terminal coma. The children, not infrequently, wake up just before they die, just for a minute. This little girl did. She suddenly sat up in bed and said, Mummy, can you see the angels? Can you hear their singing? It's beautiful. And she was gone, just like that. It turned out, of course, that the parents were Christian, and it was a huge help in their bereavement. Diane took 2 more children before she was brought back to faith, and she said, I was an arrogant Yale professor, so God used a little guy with Down syndrome to nail the coffin lid on my existentialism. The book's called A Window on Heaven, Diane Comp, HarperCollins. Buy it and buy a packet of Kleenex, because if you don't cry, there's something wrong with your heart.
I'll let you have the last word on this. I have to be careful with the answer to the question, because it'll make it sound as if there's something special about me, and I don't want to give that impression at all. But the fact of the matter is, if we came face to face, you should read Thomas Nagel's book, who's a very, very prominent atheist philosopher, who's also written a book on why Darwinian evolution can't be true. And part of the thing he writes about as well is that he says this because scientists need to come up with an atheistic theory that is true, or that people will become Christians. And he's very upfront and honest about the fact that he doesn't want there to be a God. The fact of the matter is that if you look at this and believe there has to be a designer, then what I do with my sexuality isn't completely up to me. There can't be a designer without me becoming face to face with the reality that I have to bow down to him and worship him. And our human pride, it's all in Genesis 3 and it's all in Romans 1. There's been no improvement on the answer from those 2 chapters. And that is very, very difficult and hard for any human being. And part of the mystery of grace is that God's Spirit will start to work on your heart and put within you this compulsion to acknowledge that there is a God. Revelation 3 talks about it as if it's Jesus knocking on the door of your heart, hoping that you'll open the door. And all I can tell you today is that as a result of Michael Behe's talk, if you start to have this doubt that you can be an account for all of reality that doesn't take into account the existence and reality of God, and you now start to have this sense that there might be a God, I just ask that you don't repress that, which is what Romans 1 says, and that you open the door. And it's all an act of grace. It isn't that God picks the smartest people or the most holy people. It's just part of the mystery of grace that at some point in time you are willing to acknowledge there is a God, and only Christ can make you right with him.
And on that note, that concludes our panel time. Let's take a moment to thank our panelists.